Thank you all for coming out on this rainy afternoon. As I was telling Abi, I think it's my fault. It's Abu Tammam's fault that it's so rainy today, as you can see. I'd like to thank Abi and the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center for this invitation, for allowing me to speak to a captive audience about a poem that I love so much. But before I do that, Abi also put me on the spot and said, say something about yourself. So other than the fact that I'm a fan of Abu Tammam, Habib, I teach Arabic literature at the University of Pennsylvania. I think a lot about translating poetry and how challenging that is. It keeps me up at night. I'm originally from Lebanon, and I've been living in this country in translation for almost 15 years. Most of my work recently is on modern Arabic poetry. I'm currently writing a book on the Arabic Prose Poem, something that Abu Tammam would have liked, I think. He would have considered. He would not have been too upset. But when Abir sent me her invitation and said, what is a poem you would like to read out loud in Arabic? It didn't take me too long to choose this poem, and I hope you'll see why. It's an honor for me to be speaking about this poem in front of Professor Suzanne Sterkiewicz and Professor Jaroslav Sterkiewicz. So everything that I will leave out or I will miss, I will refer you to their works on Arabic poetry, and especially Suzanne's work on Abu Tammam and the Abbasid age. So, Abu Tammam is an Abbasid Muhdath poet. Right? And sometimes, and I do this, I translate the word Muhdath as modernist or modernizers, the Abbasid modernizers. The Muhdath period in Arabic poetry is a phase that witnessed an astounding radical poetic movement. The Badi'a poetry of the Abbasid poets, as Suzanne Sterkiewicz tells us, is a linguistic correlative to the unprecedented might and dominion of the Arabo-Islamic rulers. So these poets were able, in their poetry, to create a rival or a correlative for the height of Arabo-Islamic political and military power. But at the same time, these were artists who had complicated relationships with power, and some relationships that were contradictory with power and with the multilingual, multi-ethnic societies they lived in. They intervened in the life of the Arabic language and created in their poetry linguistic events which are enduring in their consequences. All subsequent modernist projects in Arabic poetry conjure up the Abbasid moment, not as history or as a past now lapsed, but as a poetically charged moment, perpetually present. The Abbasid poets thus remain participants in the present moment of the past, if I am to borrow a phrase from T.S. Eliot. It is a moment that is not one of consecutive stations in the line of progression, but rather a moment from which time radiates in all directions. This is the very moment in which a poet stands at the intersection of beginnings and ends, and all of time radiates out of his poem. And this makes me think of a line by Abu Tammam himself, where he says, of a beauty, and I'm assuming, or I'm allowing myself to think that the subject of this line is poetry, of a beauty for which tomorrow yearns, and for which yesterday avidly longs. يشتاقه من كماله غده ويكثر الوجد نحوه الأمس. يشتاقه من كماله غده ويكثر الوجد نحوه الأمس. If talking about poetry, Abu Tammam is inviting us in this line to reconsider the arbitrariness of historical periodization when applied to poetry. If a poem can only be read as a medieval poem, then it has failed as poetry and survived as something else. There is no time before or after the poem. Both future and past yearn for that moment in the present that collapses them into each other. In the verse above, both tomorrow, ghad, and ams, and yesterday, ams, are stimulated and moved to action by beauty, by the aesthetic imperative. The poetic event is what dictates the direction of time in this context. Unlike the historical imperative, the aesthetic imperative, as Abu Tammam shows us, can reconfigure poetry's relationship to history, poeticizing it. And why am I telling you all this? Because I'm always thinking about how to apply the term modernist with all its baggage to Abbasid poets. And some of my colleagues sometimes object to that and think it anachronistic. I'll try to convince you, and you are free to object afterwards. What I'd like to focus on here in my comments, and I really like these to be just comments, observations, before I read the poem in Arabic, so Abu Tammām will have the last word, as he always does. So I'd like to focus here on the adjective modernist, which is often used to describe the achievements of the Abbasid Muhdathūn. Aside from its historical or chronological denotation, when we use the word modernist, we are signaling a specific poetic attitude and a certain type of poetic engagement. And Abu Tammām's stance vis-a-vis his tradition is that of a modernist par excellence. It is a relationship that is at once conflictual, interrogative, destructive, and creative. He and his generation of poets have succeeded by challenging their poetic tradition and rejecting some of its dimensions in preserving its enduring poetic core. He and other poets, such as the earlier Abu Nuwas, the later Abu al-Mutanabbi, are the modernizers from which the Arabic free verse movement of the 20th century takes some of its cues. We continue to hear resonances of Abu Tammām's voice in 20th century modern poetry, in Arabic and beyond. Many free verse poets in Arabic gesture towards Abu Tammām in their poetry in order to signal a poetic and a critical continuity. Abu Tammām's verses in description of spring, which are included in this poem, which he wrote in praise of the Caliph al-Mu'tasim, are some of his most memorable. They are often cited as examples of his unprecedented metaphors and his innovations of new meanings. In reading Abu Tammām's spring poem, and especially in attempting to translate it for today's reading, the challenge of metaphors stands out. It is a challenge to us as readers, to poets of his time and all times, but it's also a challenge to the patron, to the caliph, as we will see. And thus, I read and translate this poem with an eye to metaphor. And I think here of modernist metaphor, as Abdul-Qahir al-Jurjani, or T.S. Eliot, or even Atunis would describe it as the creation of new, unprecedented connections between things and ideas, connections which make up a rival new world, a correlative to the world we know, or a world that only exists in words, did not exist before they were strung together. This is metaphor as metamorphosis, as Wallace Stevens sometimes prefers to call it. It is metaphor which does not enunciate an identity, but constructs a resemblance, and I'm quoting from Wallace Stevens, and a resemblance which completes and reinforces the two different things and what they have in common. It makes them shine, it discovers them anew. And the poet, Wallace Stevens, continues and tells us, in a poem of his titled "Someone Puts a Pineapple Together," he says, "The poet must defy the metaphor that murders the metaphor. He seeks as image a second of the self." And Abu Tammām certainly defies metaphor that murders metaphor. His metaphors do not reduce the world, but multiply them. He offers in his poem a second or a double self of things. It is difficult to read this poem that I will read to you without being moved and incited to think not of new images or meanings, but more so new forms of thought. Abu Tammām, and especially in his description of spring, speaks of things that do not exist without words, or things that are the product of language thinking or stringing itself into new forms that produce unprecedented meanings. Before I go on, a note on translation. I told you it's an obsession of mine. And all of you who work in the field of literature, whether Arabic or any other peripheral nascent literature in the world today, you struggle with translation in general. It's an impossible thing to do, but with poetry it's even more. It's devastating to try to translate a poem, especially a poem you believe in, you love, you like, and you feel like you're silencing it somehow. So decontextualized translations which present themselves as faithful or accurate while obscuring their role as interventions or rewritings or rereadings are insidious and oppressive, because in Arabic, the poem can speak for itself and its reader is responsible to listen to one or many of its voices. But in translation, the voice of the poem is not all carried across. As we welcome the Abbasid poets into English, such as Tammām, and onto the global stage or the stage of world literature and other very insidious and problematic labels, we should attempt translations of Arabic poetry, especially medieval poetry, which aim at that distant meaning. The poem acquires from its context and the poetic landscape it grows out and into. Even if we decide to explore the original creative turns that translation can take, when one decides to decontextualize or deterritorialize it, shouldn't we first acquaint ourselves with the context before we abandon it? So a translator can only tap into the creative potentials of his poem in translation, or her, if she sees herself as a student of that whole tradition and not as a creator of figures or works of choice. On one hand. On the other hand, we should also think of the poem, just as we think of every poem as a reconfiguration of its whole tradition, we should also think of the translation as reconfiguring the target tradition as well, participating actively and not just sitting on the margin. The effort to imagine roots for the translated poem in the target language will result in layered textured translations that make meaningful connections and pave the way for a vibrant conversation between the two traditions. Even if the end results are always going to be lacking, the effort to make them complete is enough to transform what we do from translation of poetry into translation as poetry. Wow. So I sit to translate this poem. And this is what I did. So this is me revealing some of my tricks, which might have failed, but this is what I did. I conjured up examples of modernist metaphor in English that can be of assistance to me as I ready my English for Abu Tammām. And I'm always very conscious of my English. It's a second language, so there are layers of consciousness and hesitation, and I blush for no reason, but here I have reason to sometimes when translating. So I think of poets like Wallace Stevens, like Seamus Heaney, like Philip Larkin. I conjure up poets, and this conjuring up of names like these is not to suggest that English has claim to modernist metaphor or to modernism that I'm borrowing and opposing on Arabic. No, this is an exercise for the benefit of English. It's an exercise for the benefit of the translator. By calling up poets who, like Abu Tammām, have twisted their language's neck, offering metaphors like his that tug at the thoughts or the forms of our thoughts. So when Wallace Stevens invites us to behold the nothing that is not there and the nothing that is, I hear an echo of Abu Tammām. When Philip Larkin sees the trees coming to leaf like something almost being said, I hear an echo of Abu Tammām. So thus I surrounded myself with Stevens' snowman and Philip Larkin's trees and a great poem by Seamus Heaney titled Mint, and I sat to think to put my English in the mind of Abu Tammām. So this is a note on translation. Why did I choose this poem? And I think somebody in the audience, Muhammad, already asked me, why this poem? Growing up, I always, in my mind, I believed, I was certain that the magic of poetry, the transformation that poetry can make happen, all sit in the lines that Abu Tammām composes in description of rain in this poem. It is not just about the meanings that unfold in your mind or the things that are turning into their opposites, but also the sound. Sound first and foremost, the music of words that participates in the making of meaning in this poem. And this is a poem, it's a classical poem, it's a qasida, you have a monometer and a monorhyme, but still, they all have meaning, they all participate in creating this rival world that is a better world sometimes, and is there to challenge the world of the cave, as we will see in a minute. So the poem is a praise poem addressed to the most powerful man in the world at that time, the Caliph al-Mu'tasim. And it is clearly divided into two sections. If we're going to run down with the structure of this poem, and I'll not go into details, we can easily divide it into two sections. An opening section which describes the advent of spring and the transformation of the world into a spectacle, فَكَأَنَّمَا هِيَ مَنْظَرٌ, from line 1 to 22, and then a praise section that begins at line 22 and goes on until the end, line 32, in which Abu Tammām praises the Caliph and compares him to spring. So that's pretty straightforward. There's an interjection, an interruption in the first section at line 8, أَرَبِيعَنَا فِي 19 حِجَّةً, where Abu Tammām reveals the connection between the two sections. His direct address to the Caliph here does more than just reveal that connection between the two parts of the poem. It calls upon the Caliph and puts him on the spot by addressing him as spring, Arabiana, you are our spring. By addressing him that way in the midst of this astounding description of spring's power to mold time and smooth out its jagged edges, the stakes are set in this praise. The Caliph is being challenged here and his power confronted and balanced not only against spring, but more so against the power of metaphor that is able to portray spring in this way. This poem, especially in its second section, performs the traditional well-recognized ritual of praise, in this case, praising the most powerful man in the world. However, at the subtext of this poem, Abu Tammām flaunts the power of metaphor in the face of political military power. He confronts political power with the power of metaphor as its equal, as its rival, and even as its better in disordering the world, capturing it, and reigning it. The two rivals revealed here in this poem, thus, are poetry or metaphor on one side and time and history on the other. And there is nothing more powerful than the invitation to look in this poem, in line 11 to 13. يا صاحبي تقصيا نظريكما يا صاحبي تقصيا نظريكما ترى وجوه الأرض كيف تصور. The expanse of line 11, which harnesses the sound of the dual in Arabic, يا صاحبي تقصيا نظريكما, comes at a crucial point in the poem and plays an important role in setting up the praise. Before we turn to the patron and what he has done and what he can do and what we hope he will do, we pause here at the work of spring which shapes and transforms the whole world for us. We are invited to look and see the world fashioned as if for the first time. The sound and the gaze that accompany us as we look is singularly Abu Tammām's. It is as if a curtain is being pulled and the whole world is revealed to you. Look, here it is, transformed into something other than itself. فَكَأَنَّمَا هِيَ مَنْظَرٌ. It is this presence of spring and this consequence of spring that the Caliph should aspire to emulate, if he were to live up to this praise. And since it is a spring only revealed in Abu Tammām's poetic language, it is the power of metaphor that is presented as a challenge. So Abu Tammām, before he goes on to praise the king as just and generous, he unsheathes the sword of metaphor, and challenges him not to be like spring, but even more. Can you become a metaphor? Is the challenge. When we arrive at his work, at the patron's work, which is praised as unforgettable, lasting across the stretch of time in line 24, we are acutely aware that it is the power of this poem that can achieve that for the patron. I will not comment on every line, and I'm really eager to read, but I will comment on one line, the very first line in the poem. And I have to say that in translating this poem, I benefited from an earlier full translation of this poem done by Julia Gray and published in the Journal of Arabic Literature in 1994. And because the Abu Tammāmian metaphor is a complex knot of associations, knowing a complex knot of associations where she drew out one strand, I intentionally tried to draw out another, knowing that both or all are present in the Arabic. With Bray's translation in mind, I also imagined myself participating in a tradition of translation for this poem, in hope of arriving at something that might equal the original. So the more translations of this poem, the better, I think, for English, for the sanity of all of us who try to read it in English. So where she translates the first line, رقت حواشي الدهر فهي تمرمر وغدا الثرى في حله يتكسر. Where she translates the first shutter, رقت حواشي الدهر, thinking of the image of cloth and trims of a dress, حواشي, swaying and quivering, رقت حواشي الدهر فهي تمرمر. I see stone. I've always read this line as a little girl, with this thinking that marmar, that marble, had something to do with this. And I was always disappointed when the shuruh didn't mention any of that. They always talked about dresses and trims of dresses. But I cannot shake off the association with marble or marmar. I like the image of marble being worked and smoothed out as in sculpture. So my initial translation, which is not in your handout, was the edges of time now rounded like marble. I opted against that for one reason, because it includes a simile. And I thought that Abu Tammam's metaphor is more direct and sudden and immediate, and a simile would weaken that. But if I were given room to comment on the first line in its translation, I would still defend my decision to see stone. In my mind, time, especially Arabic poetic time, so time in the Arabic poetic landscape is jagged, it's sharp, it's pointy. It is the agent that wears out everything else and smooth stone. We're thinking of atlal here. In the background of all of this, stone imagery is crucial to the qasida, especially the opening. Stone is always the witness to the work of time, that it proves to us what time can do and what it has done. And here in this poem, it's a very beautiful inversion and satisfying inversion to see time itself as the stone that's being worked. So it's as if the figure of time has been rounded like marble. Just like spring transforms the world into something other than itself, this poem by Abu Tammām presents to us time like it has never seen itself before, especially in an Arabic poem. Time in this poem is unlike time in any other Arabic poem. The afflictions and the vicissitudes and the calamities, which usually open the archetypal qasida, are only negated at the very end. فَلْيَعْصُرَنَّ عَلَى اللَّيَالِ بَعْدَهُ أَنْ يُبْتَلَى بِصُنُوفِهِنَّ الْمُعْسِرِ. And another crucial station in this poem is line 28, where he says, which, this is again the inversion, سَكَنَ الزَّمَانُ سَكَنَ الزَّمَانُ فَلَا يَدٌ مَذْمُومَةٌ لِلْحَادِثَاتِ وَلَا سَوَامٌ يُذْعَرُ. Time has been reined in and tamed and smoothed and made to obey. And thus time here submits to poetry, to metaphor. It surrenders and submits to the new aesthetic imperative. So these are my thoughts on it. And I will read it to you now, unless you have some questions or comments. So this is the test. After all this, I will read the poem to you, and and then we'll have a little conversation. And I'd be very curious to hear your comments on the translation. This is very much a work in progress, as you know and see. And another note, you might have the Arabic, which is full of typos. So excuse that. I got it somewhere on the internet. Never trust any website that has a poem in Arabic, classical or modern. Never trust it. Go back to your grammar book. رقت حواشي الدهر فهي تمرمر وغدا الثرى في حله يتكسر نزلت مقدمة المصيف حميدة ويد الشتاء جديدة لا تكفر لولا الذي غرس الشتاء بكفه لاقى المصيف شائما لا تثمر. كم ليلة آسى البلاد بنفسه فيها ويوم وابله مثعنجر. مطر يذوب الصحو منه وبعده، مطر يذوب الصحو منه وبعده صحو يكاد من الغضارة يمطر. غيثان فالأنواء غيث ظاهر لك وجهه، والصحو غيث مضمر. وندى إذا ادهنت به لمم الثرى، خلت السحاب أتاه وهو معثر. أربيعنا في 19 حجة حقا لهنك للربيع الأزهر. ما كانت الأيام تسلب بهجة لو أن حسن الروض كان يعمر. أولا ترى الأشياء إن هي غيرت سمجت، وحسن الأرض حين تغير. يا صاحبي تقصيا نظريكما، تريا وجوه الأرض كيف تصور. تريا نهارا مشمسا قد شابه زهر الربا فكأنما هو مقمر. دنيا معاش للورى حتى إذا جلي الربيع فإنما هي منظر. أضحت تصوب بطونها لظهورها نورا تكاد له القلوب تنور. من كل زاهرة ترقرق بالندى فكأنها عين عليه تحدر. تبدو ويحجبها الجميم كأنها عذراء تبدو تارة وتخفر. حتى غدت وهداتها ونجادها فئتين في قلع الربيع تبختر. مصفرة محمرة فكأنها عصب تيمن في الوغى وتمضر. من فاقع غض النبات كأنه در يشقق قبل ثم يزعفر. أو ساطع في حمرة فكأنما يدنو إليه من الهواء معصفر. صنع الذي لولا بدائع صنعه ما عاد أصفر بعد إذ هو أخضر. خلق أطل من الربيع كأنه خلق الإمام وهديه المتيسر. في الأرض من عدل الإمام وجوده ومن النبات الغض سرج تزهر. تنسى الرياض وما يروض فعله أبداً على مر الليالي يذكر. إن الخليفة حين يظلم حادث عين الهدى وله الخلافة محجر. كثرت به حركاتها ولقد ترى من فترة وكأنها تتفكر. ما زلت أعلم أن عقدة أمرها في كفه مذ خليت تتخير. سكن الزمان فلا يد مذمومة للحادثات ولا سوام يذعر. نظم البلاد فأصبحت وكأنها عقد وكأن العدل فيه جوهر. لم يبق مبدأ موحش إلا ارتوى بذكره إلا ارتوى من ذكره. لم يبق مبدأ موحش إلا ارتوى من ذكره فكأنما هو محضر. ملك يضل الفخر في أيامه ويقل في نفحاته ما يكثر. فليعسرن على الليالي بعده أن يبتلى بصروفهن المعاصر. Questions, comments, objections? Yes.
Speaking as someone who translates Abbasi poetry into English and who observes that one of the big differences between English poetry and Arabic poetry and the Abbasi poetry is that English poems have titles. How did you choose the title Spring, or how did you choose
Julia Gray's translation? She attempts to translate it in meter, and that is a very impressive thing to do. It does not always succeed though, because it becomes much more forced. It's not really forced here, right? So, yeah, that's something to think about. because ultimately the goal is to come out, to leave the translation table with a poem in English. Like that is the goal. That doesn't always happen. It rarely happens. It might never happen. But you want to have a text that you can read and enjoy the sound of in English. So that's a good goal to have as a translator. Yes?
I have a question about your process, because at the beginning you said, these are the things that keep me up at night. So when you are in the type of work that you're in and you're translating poems, are you ever finished? Or are you ever satisfied?
No, that's why I mentioned the idea of participating in a tradition, thinking that this is one block in a structure that you hope we will end up with. Many translations that will end up creating the reputation of this poem in English. And this is very crucial for literary traditions like Arabic in the world today, where translation has power, more power. So, and this is an example I always give, so people who know me are probably bored of it. So we don't need, when somebody says, I'm going to translate the Odyssey, nobody's worried, because Homer can defend himself. There are millions of translations, not many translations out there, that will judge the new translation. Homer is safe. Whereas if you say, I'm translating Abu Tammām, I'm translating Shamfar, I'm translating Bashar Nuburd, then that's it. This is going to be Bashar Nuburd's representative in English, and we are going to distort him once and for all. So there's a need for translations, more translations from these peripheral, as they're called, literary traditions. And this applies to modern as well. So there are very, very few translations of poetry. The case in the novel is different. Right? But with poetry, the violence that happens in translation is much more, it's deeper and much more lasting in creating the reputation of these works in the other language. So I'm up at night.
So you feel a deep sense of responsibility, I think.
Well, yes, especially towards the poets I'm working on, because there is responsibility. Yes?
I have a strange question, and most of my questions are usually quite strange, in the sense that they tend to be pieces that come together. So the first question is, when you think about time as the stone, or stone as the edges is either rough or smooth, or both, all. Somehow we think of stone as being a cleaning agent, like water rushing through it. And so I'm thinking about if metaphor and time are working with the stone or through the stone, how are you imagining like the ideal poem coming out? Because in spring, this leader is basically bringing life back, which is of course like something in nature. So how do you think that comes together in a poem? Is that a weird question?
It is weird. I mean, it's good. This is the Muhdathūn world. I'm not sure. So water and stone working together. See, the thing that's that the caliph is being confronted with in this poem is the power of nature, right? That is, what does, I'm going to try, I forget the line, but something that Bashar Nuburd says, that at the end what remains is a qasid, right? Everything will be worn out, right? So he's telling him, your presence is as transient as anything that water is going to wash away, springs are going to change, seasons are going to change, even stone will be worn out, as happens in the Tammām. Yeah. But the agent that's new here is metaphor, that is going to keep all of that timeless, really. So the memory of the caliph, this description of spring that we sit here in Washington, D.C. talking about today, right? So the catalyst, the magic, the ingredient that makes this unlike anything else is this type of metaphor. Like, it's metaphor in general, but this type of metaphor especially. I hope I answered your question, but even if I did, I'll take it with me.
Good enough.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I would like to bring Bahturi and his famous poem,
Yes.
Rabia, and compare it with this one.
Yes.
Regards two things. The
Thank
first
you.
one, the one that you just touched but didn't want to annoy us with digging deeper in it, which is the hidden feeling of bitterness in this poem, and the spring is just there to cover it.
Yes.
And it's there in the very first line, and you mentioned Hawash al-Dahr, and I will also mention al-Thara, which is usually related to al-Maut, death. But I will also talk about the poetics of Abu Tammām and how much in this poem he needed to compromise his poetics to match the famous poem of Bahtori, Rabia.
Yes. Yes, I agree. So you're best.
No,
but let me comment on
teach
it.
us.
No, I agree with you. I see. I like to read a little bit of bitterness in every praise poem, especially by the poets I like. So you like to think that that Abu Tammām, well, he doesn't walk into the presence of the Mu'tasim. We know he stays to the side, right? So he's watching. Has a feeling. So we're imagining. This is fantasy. We're imagining that he thinks himself better than this man. So every poet and every politician. And as Professor Suzanne Statkevich shows us in the exchange of the praise, there's always a threat that's embedded in it. So this is going to turn on you if you don't live up to it. So I'm the one who's here to set the challenge for you, the bar. This is what you should be. You live up to it, you fail or you succeed. It's the poem that's here to judge you, not the other way around. So yes, I see that. And the fact that the metaphor here is so astounding, so powerful, so mind-blowing. And then the praise, which is you're just, you're good, you deserve your position. It seems very little in comparison. So thinking of يكثر ويقل في نفحاته ما يكثر أبو تمام يقل في نفحاته ما يكثر مش المعتصم. So I like to see that tension, and I agree with you. Bahtori's Rabia is present when you read this poem. أتاك الربيع الطلق يختار ضاحكا. And again, that's another thing I like to imagine and keep in the back of my mind, that these poets were really writing for each other, right? And the caliph was an excuse and the source of income. But so this is really a conversation between poets. Bahtori and Abu Tammām were always thinking of each other. Bahtori probably thinking of Abu Tammām more. But there's someone in this poem, there's someone else later who's thinking about them, who's Mutanabbi. So speaking of what happens to time, Abu Tammām tells us, سكن الزمان فلا يد مذمومة للحادثات ولا سوام يذعر. Mutanabbi comes and says, جمح الزمان فلا لذيذ خالص مما يشوب ولا سرور خالد ولا سرور كامل. جمح الزمان فلا لذيذ خالص مما يشوب ولا سرور كامل. He takes the line, he rewrites it, but exactly the opposite meaning. If you're only reading Mutanabbi's line, you think this is Zaman as we know it in the pre-Islamic Qasida, Jamih, dominating, destroying, we submit to it. But it's not. This is Zaman, time after it had passed through the lens of Abu Tammām, because Mutanabbi is specifically rewriting Abu Tammām's line. So he's taking time that Abu Tammām sakan Zaman, and he's allowing this to become Jamih again. So that idea of poets writing for each other, writing on top of each other's poems, is also probably most prominent in reading the works of all of these poets. Yes?
Can't resist throwing in a word or two. Thank you very much for this presentation and this wonderful translation of this poem. It's very exciting. I think translations are one way that make a poem come alive, because you see someone really interacting with it, really trying to figure out every little detail of the meaning and what it could mean, or that sort of thing. So it's not only a beautiful translation, it's very engaging and compelling one. And also looking at a translation is the reading of the poem. I just want to point out a couple other aspects of the poem when we look at it within the whole tradition. This might have something to do with the idea of titles too. I find titles kind of annoying because traditionally Arab poems did not have a title. They might be referred to kind of as a spring poem or his Amoria poem, but it's not officially a title, the way in English a poet often has a very intentional title that directs us toward the poem. But of course, the problem is that within the Arabic tradition, people knew the tradition and they already know what a panegyric poem is, what a praise poem to a caliph is going to be. They're already so oriented in so many ways to what's going to happen. And the problem with translating is, how do you, in some kind of title, engage the English reader to an understanding of this whole world of poetry? One can't entirely, but Edges of Time is not a bad idea. The moment that he addresses here, I think also, is one, if you remember, what I always notice, there's a day of spring when you suddenly go out and you feel as though you're being caressed instead of going out like this all winter. And I think that's what this hawashi, this dahar, which means like time, but it's also kind of the weather and the seasons and all these things as well. So there's something there. The other thing is the very old and archetypal image of the ruler in the fertility cycle that the traditional ancient Middle Eastern king represented time overcoming seasonal changes and therefore being a perpetual spring, which is a very pre-Islamic epithet for somebody too. There's, I think it's Rabi'a as-Sa'ili, the springtime for the beggars. The idea that a man who was so wealthy that he could give people plenty, he could feed the poor all year long. So it's quite a moving, and it's very interesting because to us it's very lyrical, but in the Arabic context, the ruler at springtime is more moral than lyrical. It's having the power to own a lot and to have the generosity to provide for everyone all year long. So the combination of the lyrical and the sort of moral and archetypal, I think is very interesting here. And then especially as you pointed out, when he calls him Arabiana, this must have been a great moment of court. I think this is great. But what I was going to say in terms of the power play between the poet and the caliph, one thing I want to say is that it had to be known from the beginning that to the audience, and when he's talking about spring, he's talking about the caliph. So the real thing here is, can the caliph live up to this image? It also reminded me of what they always say in Jaz al-Quran, and Majaz ablaghu min al-haqiqa. The metaphorical speech is more powerful than literary speech. So the imaging of the caliph as spring and the achievement of this metaphor is more powerful praise to the caliph himself than merely saying, oh, you're so powerful, or something like that. So I think to understand that from the very beginning that spring is the caliph is kind of essential to this. And then one thing I would warn against, not every poet is Mutanabbi.
Thank God.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, so Mutanabbi creates a persona for himself, which may or may not be real, but it's certainly there in his poetry, of this brash, and I am better than you, and his relationship to his patrons is, he always portrays himself as being somehow superior, somehow having the upper hand. Well, first of all, politically he did, because there were no political strongmen at his time. Nobody had that kind of upper hand with Muhdathūn. It was a very, he was a very tough guy. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, I don't think we want to project, I think modern poetry, most of us, I call it like the junior high school approach to poetry, which is where we all learn to love poetry. Because that's when you start loving poetry when you're 12, 13, 14, is this romantic figure of the poet. Now, Mutanabbi creates such a romantic figure that appeals to us as moderns in this, we'd like to be post-romantic, but we're probably not. But I don't think we should be projecting that back on other poets or poets generally, nor, even more important, our own distaste for court poetry should not lead us to to kind of, how do you say, tabriya, to kind of excuse poets by making up, oh, he didn't really mean that, or he was really, certainly they were not as abject in their poetry. Probably a lot of them were. The great ones somehow go beyond that simply because their poetry is greater than any of the political circumstances they were involved with. But I think to try to resurrect them as great romantic figures is treading on rather dangerous ground. And I think also for Abu Tammām, his poetry is so abstracted. I think of him as having a very abstract metaphorical mind. It's hard to imagine him.
Yeah, he's not a romantic. He's more of an academic, like an assistant professor on a tenure track.
Yeah,
very abstract.
But very, very engaged in the abstraction.
Yes, definitely.
But also then relating to what you said though, very engaged in the power of language.
Yes, and this is why he made me, or I thought it would be helpful to think of people like Wallace Stevens, poets who are very abstract in what they do with metaphor. You're right, it's probably problematic to try to romanticize him, but this poem, especially this poem, unlike the Amuri poem, in this poem there is this imbalance between what he does with metaphor and spring, and definitely the fertility imagery is all there, and the praise. And Sayyid and I were trying to imagine Abu Tammām bitter for our own benefit. This is our fantasy, how to relate to parts of this poem that frankly, there are parts of this poem that I don't like, especially the Tammām and Tamaddaru part. There are images that seem to be, I don't know, much flatter than the other section. So yes, I would not defend a persona, me constructing a persona of Abu Tammām that's similar to Mutanabi. You're right.
Yeah, well, has a persona. Mutanabi constructed his own persona.
He did,
believe
yes.
he was really like that or not, but he did. You can't avoid it in reading his poetry.
No,
I don't think.
Yeah.
Abu Tammām, whatever he was actually like, it's not recorded for us. And what's in his poetry, one doesn't get a sense. I mean, I spent my youth on Abu Tammām, and I never felt any sense of being close to him as a person. I just felt, which is how I thought I would start out. I thought I was going to write some kind of sentimental biography. I was a young girl. I know it's hard to remember. This was decades ago. And then I got into the poetry more and more, and you become more and more, kind of a sort of an engineering approach to things like this. Anyway, I think it's time for me to stop. Thank you very much. This was very nice.
If I may, maybe context. I mean, obviously you mentioned context. Context is very important. Maybe you can help us also appreciate this more. If you give us an idea about the history, when was this poem said, what happened before it, what happened after it, was he favored as a court poet at that time? Is that relevant?
Is it relevant? What do you think? It's a good question. I don't really know much details. There are authorities in the room, but Abu Tammām was the most prominent poet of his time, and he was the poet of Mu'tasim. He was the caliph, right? The Khalifa. This is the highest position a poet would have, so he is the poet in the court. Yes, and what is the specific occasion of this poem? I'm not sure. It's a poem in praise of a Mu'tasim. So unlike other poems where there is an occasion, and a battle or a victory of some sort, I'm not sure what the occasion is here. But when we're talking about power dynamics, we're talking about a period where Arabo-Islamic hegemony was at its height. So the Khalifa was the most powerful man in the world. Yes. And this was his poet praising him. So there is that dynamic of power between them. I don't think more context is necessary, especially if we're reading this as poetry, not as something else. Unless somebody else has any other details about the context. Yes?
You mentioned in the beginning multilingual aspect to this poem. I was wondering if you could discuss that a little more. I mean, obviously, at the height of the power, possible Persian influence or Would you be able to articulate a little bit more on the multilingual aspect of this poem?
Not this poem. I was referring to the multilingual aspect of Basque society.
Okay.
So people knew other languages, were exposed to other languages. With Tammām, we know that the critics find fault with him or praise him for coining new words, right? So mut'anjiru is a word that he takes credit for. So these poets were also involved in this practice of coining new words, intervening in the language to that extent. The other Basque poets might have also spoken and written in other languages. We know the earlier Bashar ibn Burd was of Persian descent, and he would brag of it in his poetry. I think Mutanabbi might have it included some Persian words in some verses when he was praising rulers in Persia. So there is that infiltration, of course, and an influence between the poetic traditions as well, but not this poem.
Thank you.
Time.
Just one thing. You said kind of in the beginning that you didn't hold the poem in Arabic up to English, you held English up to the poem. And do you feel as if that kind of puts the language of the poem in an empowered position, because you're not trying to fit it into another kind of culture?
I like how you're holding me to my comment. Yes. Yes. Because, again, there is a power dynamic in translation, right? And Arabic is a weaker language when it comes to English, right? And you know, in translation studies, we talk about domesticating and foreignizing, whether we are translating to satisfy the palate of an English reader, or are we translating to shock the English reader, to make him or her think or see English as she's never seen it before. So I like that inversion of holding the target language up to the poem and not the other way around, especially in cases like this, where to start off, the Arabic poem is already at a disadvantage. Not just because it's Arabic and we don't have enough translations from Arabic poetry, but because this is a classical poem as well. Even for a readership in Arabic, a classical poem is at a disadvantage. Yeah, and people have these assumptions about what classical poetry is, right? That it's formulaic, it's traditional, there's nothing that's going to shock you. Well, that's not true, right? So with English, I think it's necessary to back up, to be on the side of the poem as opposed to English, the monster of English. Yeah.
Just wanted to say thank you for your presentation. It's quite inspirational, actually, the way you presented it.
Thank you.
It's really, I want to go and read a lot of Arabic poetry tonight.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you about the process of memorization. I was just so impressed and just to see you recite it. It reminded me, and this is a compliment of my dad when he reads the Quran. He really goes into a trance.
Yeah.
So it was really very good that today we're here listening to you. And I hope that for those of us who cannot comment on the translation, if you could perhaps say a few words about how you memorized it, and was this something that you started when you were small, you were interested in it? And then the other part that I wanted to ask you was, you mentioned something about taking this kind of poem from the internet and how dangerous it is because of, you don't know where the hamza is and the kasra is and the sukun is.
Yeah.
So we are students of Arabic, and I'm wondering if you have some good suggestions on where to look and how to make sure that
So
we're reading it right.
Thank you very much for your comment. And when it comes to poetry, I think you need to have use your grammar book as a shield. Even when you're reading in print, there are always typos, even in print. But on the internet, it's much worse, especially with poetry. There are many problems with the text. But you don't need it. It shouldn't be a problem if you know your grammar well, right? That is your lifeline. Yes, I can't really say more about why the internet's so problematic, but about memorizing, yes, this is a poem that I've known and I've read for a very long time. So I haven't memorized all of it, but there are parts of it that, are always playing in my head. And I relate to that, a father going into a trance reading poetry. I think some of us in this room have figures like that in our lives.
Thank you.